June 28, 1945, Willow Run, Michigan. In the shadow of dawn, the final B-24 Liberator rolls off the assembly line. Its aluminum skin gleams under fluorescent lights that have burned continuously for 3 years. The engines are silent. The workers stand back. No celebration, no fanfare. Just the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. In 63 minutes, another bomber would have followed. But there will be no next plane. The war in Europe is over. Japan will surrender in weeks. And in this moment of stillness, in this cavernous factory stretching more than a mile in length, the magnitude of what has been accomplished begins to reveal itself. Over 8,000 B-24s from this single plant. Nearly 300,000 military aircraft from a nation that, just 5 years earlier, could barely build 100. This is not a story of silence in the literal sense. There was noise, the deafening thunder of rivet guns, the screaming pitch of metal cutting through metal, the constant drone of engines being tested on runways that stretched across former farmland. But it is a story of a different kind of silence. The silence of engineers who solved impossible problems without proclamation. The silence of workers who transformed an entire industrial base in 18 months without waiting for permission. The silence of a democracy that, when confronted with existential threat, simply did what needed to be done. The phrase "built in total silence" captures something essential about the American character during World War II. Not secrecy, though secrecy existed. Not quietness, though determination ran deep. But rather a grim, methodical efficiency. A refusal to debate whether the impossible could be done. A commitment to doing it anyway. To understand how America built an air force from almost nothing, we must first understand how close the world came to being lost. In January 1939, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress with a request that shocked the nation. He wanted $300 million for military aircraft. $300 million when the country was barely emerging from the Depression. $300 million when the Army Air Corps ranked behind Poland and Romania in total aircraft strength. $300 million when American factories had produced fewer than 3,000 military planes in the entire previous year. The skeptics were legion. Isolationist senators called it warmongering. Industrial leaders called it impossible. Even Roosevelt's own advisors quietly questioned whether American manufacturing could ever match the mechanized efficiency of German industry. Adolf Hitler had spent 6 years building the Luftwaffe into the most fearsome air force the world had ever seen. The Messerschmitt fighters rolling off German assembly lines represented not just superior engineering, but a different philosophy of warfare itself. While America slept, Germany had armed. But Roosevelt understood something his critics did not. He understood that wars in the 20th century would not be won by generals alone. They would be won by factories, by supply chains, by the productive capacity to simply outbuild, outlast, and overwhelm the enemy. On May 16, 1940, with France falling and Britain standing alone, Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat that would reshape the American economy. He called for 50,000 aircraft per year. 50,000. The number was staggering. It exceeded everything America had ever built since the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903. Critics called it fantasy. One aviation executive sneered that you cannot expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. Roosevelt was undeterred. By December 1940, with London burning under German bombs, he went further. He declared that America must become the arsenal of democracy, not might become, must become. The phrase entered the American lexicon as both promise and prophecy. Within weeks, Roosevelt expanded his goal. Not 50,000 aircraft, but 125,000 per year by 1943. The transformation he demanded was not incremental. It was total. And it would require the largest industrial mobilization in human history. The obstacles were immediate and profound. American aircraft production in 1939 had been almost entirely custom work. Each plane was essentially hand-built by skilled craftsmen who understood the nuances of airframe construction. You could not simply scale that up. You needed blueprints, which often did not exist in usable form. You needed precision tooling, which had never been manufactured at scale. You needed raw materials, aluminum in particular, and the supply chains to deliver those materials to factories that did not yet exist. You needed workers who understood riveting, welding, and the thousand technical details of aircraft assembly. And you needed all of this while the men who knew how to do it were being drafted into military service. Moreover, you needed factories, not small workshops, but vast industrial complexes with climate control, specialized equipment, and assembly lines measured in fractions of miles. Building such factories would normally take years. Roosevelt demanded it be done in months. The automotive industry offered the most obvious model. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had perfected mass production techniques for automobiles. Henry Ford's Highland Park plant had revolutionized manufacturing with the moving assembly line. Surely those same techniques could be applied to aircraft. But aircraft were not automobiles. A 1940 automobile contained roughly 15,000 parts and weighed 3,000 pounds. A B-24 Liberator bomber contained 450,000 parts, 360,000 rivets in 550 different sizes, and weighed 36,000 pounds fully loaded. It was not simply bigger, it was different in kind. Automobile frames were steel, designed to be forgiving. Aircraft were aluminum, which cracked if you over-torqued a rivet. Cars had relatively loose tolerances. You could file down a misaligned part. Aircraft required precision to 0.02 of an inch. A mistake on a car fender meant a small dent. A mistake on an aircraft wing meant structural failure at 20,000 feet and a crew of 10 men falling to their deaths. The aviation industry itself resisted. Company after company insisted that mass production would compromise quality. Reuben Fleet, head of Consolidated Aircraft, which designed the B-24, was openly skeptical when Charlie Sorensen, Henry Ford's right-hand man, visited the San Diego plant in January 1941. Fleet's workers were building bombers outdoors on steel fixtures, using surveyors' transits mounted on the back of pickup trucks to align engine mounts. It took 4 hours to hang a single engine. Sorensen watched in disbelief. When Fleet asked how Ford would do it better, Sorensen promised an answer by morning. That answer would change everything. The Willow Run plant was never supposed to exist. It began as a compromise, a political calculation to keep factories within a single county for tax purposes. It became the single most important aircraft production facility in the world. Construction began in April 1941 on flat Michigan farmland outside Ypsilanti, 25 miles west of Detroit. The site was Henry Ford's personal property, which solved the land acquisition problem. It was accessible by road and rail, which solved the logistics problem. It was far enough from Detroit to have room for an airfield, which solved the testing problem, but the scale was unprecedented. Architect Albert Kahn designed a structure with 3.5 million square feet of floor space under a single roof. At the time, it was the largest factory in the world. The assembly line stretched over 1 mile in length and included 4 massive turntables that allowed the B-24 production line to make a 90-degree turn midway through construction. This was not an engineering flourish, it was necessity. The original design would have extended the factory into the planned airfield. The solution was elegant and unprecedented. Turn the assembly line 90 degrees, bend the factory into an L shape. Build the impossible anyway. By November 1941, the main structure was complete. 6 months and $47 million after breaking ground, the factory was ready for workers. But having a factory did not mean having production. The early months at Willow Run were chaos. Ford engineers, accustomed to steel automobile frames with forgiving tolerances, struggled with aluminum aircraft construction. They tried to use the same techniques. They drilled oversized holes to allow for hand-fitting of parts, the way you would with a car fender. Consolidated aircraft engineers had to intervene immediately. In aircraft construction, every hole had to be precise. Every rivet had to seat correctly. There was no margin for improvisation. Moreover, Ford initially lacked the blueprints to actually build the plane. Consolidated had sketches, drawings, and templates, but not the standardized technical documentation Ford needed for mass production. Design changes arrived constantly from the Army Air Forces, reflecting lessons learned from combat in Europe. Each change meant retooling. Each retooling meant delays. Each delay meant bomber crews flying obsolete aircraft into German flak. The pressure was immense. Each factory faced similar challenges. Each solved them differently, but all operated under the same umbrella organization, the War Production Board, established by executive order on January 16, 1942. The WPB was not a planning committee. It was a command structure with the authority to compel industry to produce war materiel. It could allocate scarce materials, establish production priorities, ration commodities, and prohibit non-essential manufacturing. Under its direction, factories that made silk ribbons began producing parachutes. Automobile plants built tanks. Typewriter companies manufactured machine guns. Undergarment factories sewed mosquito netting. Even a roller coaster manufacturer converted to producing bomber repair platforms. The scale of conversion was breathtaking. In 1941, American factories produced more than 3 million automobiles. By 1943, civilian automobile production had ceased entirely. Every automotive assembly line had been repurposed for military production. The steel, rubber, and aluminum that would have gone into family sedans now went into Sherman tanks, jeeps, and aircraft. It was not voluntary. It was directed by the War Production Board with the full force of presidential authority behind it. The raw material challenges were staggering. Aluminum production had to increase more than sixfold to meet aircraft demand. The Alcoa plant in Mobile, Alabama, processed millions of pounds of alumina used to build aircraft. Rubber, cut off from Southeast Asian supplies by Japanese conquest, had to be synthesized domestically through a crash program in chemical engineering. Steel production, already the largest in the world, doubled between 1940 and 1944. Copper, essential for electrical wiring, was rationed so tightly that the Manhattan Project building the atomic bomb had to borrow thousands of tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury as a substitute. But materials were only part of the equation. You needed people. And by 1942, the people were vanishing into military service. The draft claimed 16 million American men over the course of the war. That left a labor shortage of catastrophic proportions. The solution was as pragmatic as it was revolutionary. If the men were gone, the women would take their place. Her name was Rose Will Monroe. She was 23 years old, a widow with 2 young daughters when she arrived at Willow Run in 1942 looking for work. She had no training in aircraft construction, no experience with rivet guns or precision tooling. What she had was necessity. Her husband had died in a car accident. She needed to support her children, and America needed workers. She was hired. Rose Monroe became a riveter, one of thousands of women who learned to handle the heavy, vibrating pneumatic guns that drove metal rivets through aircraft frames. Riveting was brutal work. The guns weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, vibrated constantly, and produced noise levels that caused permanent hearing damage. Riveters worked in teams with buckers, who held a steel plate called a bucking bar against the opposite side of the rivet. When the riveter fired, the rivet slammed into the bucking bar and flattened, creating a seal that held 2 metal plates together. A good team could complete hundreds of rivets per hour. They had to. Each B-24 required 360,000 of them. Rose Monroe was good enough that she was featured in a promotional film for the War Department, demonstrating proper riveting technique to encourage other women to join the workforce. She became, in some accounts, the inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter propaganda posters that urged women to join the defense industry. Whether she was the original Rosie is debated. Several women have been identified as possible inspirations, including Rosalind P. Walter, who riveted Corsair fighters in Connecticut, and Rosina Bonavada, who worked for Convair in San Diego. But the historical truth is less important than the cultural truth. Rosie the Riveter was all of them. She was the symbol of millions of women who entered the workforce when their country called. By November 1943, the aircraft industry employed more than 2 million workers. 486,000 were women, accounting for 37% of the workforce. They were welders, riveters, mechanics, inspectors, and engineers. They operated lathes, punch presses, and drill rigs. They climbed inside wing sections to install hydraulic lines in spaces too cramped for most men. They worked night shifts, day shifts, and rotating shifts. They earned the same wages as men for the same work, a rarity in American industry at the time. Each factory faced similar challenges. Each solved them differently, but all operated under the same umbrella organization, the War Production Board, established by executive order on January 16, 1942. The WPB was not a planning committee. It was a command structure with the authority to compel industry to produce war materiel. It could allocate scarce materials, establish production priorities, ration commodities, and prohibit non-essential manufacturing. Under its direction, factories that made silk ribbons began producing parachutes. Automobile plants built tanks. Typewriter companies manufactured machine guns. Undergarment factories sewed mosquito netting. Even a roller coaster manufacturer converted to producing bomber repair platforms. The scale of conversion was breathtaking. In 1941, American factories produced more than 3 million automobiles. By 1943, civilian automobile production had ceased entirely. Every automotive assembly line had been repurposed for military production. The steel, rubber, and aluminum that would have gone into family sedans now went into Sherman tanks, jeeps, and aircraft. It was not voluntary. It was directed by the War Production Board with the full force of presidential authority behind it. The raw material challenges were staggering. Aluminum production had to increase more than sixfold to meet aircraft demand. The Alcoa plant in Mobile, Alabama, processed millions of pounds of alumina used to build aircraft. Rubber, cut off from Southeast Asian supplies by Japanese conquest, had to be synthesized domestically through a crash program in chemical engineering. Steel production, already the largest in the world, doubled between 1940 and 1944. Copper, essential for electrical wiring, was rationed so tightly that the Manhattan Project building the atomic bomb had to borrow thousands of tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury as a substitute. But materials were only part of the equation. You needed people. And by 1942, the people were vanishing into military service. The draft claimed 16 million American men over the course of the war. That left a labor shortage of catastrophic proportions. The solution was as pragmatic as it was revolutionary. If the men were gone, the women would take their place. Her name was Rose Monroe. She was 23 years old, a widow with 2 young daughters when she arrived at Willow Run in 1942 looking for work. She had no training in aircraft construction, no experience with rivet guns or precision tooling. What she had was necessity. Her husband had died in a car accident. She needed to support her children, and America needed workers. She was hired. Rose Monroe became a riveter, one of thousands of women who learned to handle the heavy, vibrating pneumatic guns that drove metal rivets through aircraft frames. Riveting was brutal work. The guns weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, vibrated constantly, and produced noise levels that caused permanent hearing damage. Riveters worked in teams with buckers, who held a steel plate called a bucking bar against the opposite side of the rivet. When the riveter fired, the rivet slammed into the bucking bar and flattened, creating a seal that held 2 metal plates together. A good team could complete hundreds of rivets per hour. They had to. Each B-24 required 360,000 of them. Rose Monroe was good enough that she was featured in a promotional film for the War Department, demonstrating proper riveting technique to encourage other women to join the workforce. She became, in some accounts, the inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter propaganda posters that urged women to join the defense industry. Whether she was the original Rosie is debated. Several women have been identified as possible inspirations, including Rosalind P. Walter, who riveted Corsair fighters in Connecticut, and Rosina Bonavada, who worked for Convair in San Diego. But the historical truth is less important than the cultural truth. Rosie the Riveter was all of them. She was the symbol of millions of women who entered the workforce when their country called. By November 1943, the aircraft industry employed more than 2 million workers. 486,000 were women, accounting for 37% of the workforce. They were welders, riveters, mechanics, inspectors, and engineers. They operated lathes, punch presses, and drill rigs. They climbed inside wing sections to install hydraulic lines in spaces too cramped for most men. They worked night shifts, day shifts, and rotating shifts. They earned the same wages as men for the same work, a rarity in American industry at the time. Many were housewives who had never worked outside the home. Many were young women straight out of high school. Some were African American women who fled the oppressive conditions of domestic service and sharecropping for better paying factory work. An estimated 600,000 Black women joined the defense industry workforce, finding opportunities for higher wages and skilled work that had been denied them before the war. It was far from equal. Discrimination persisted. Black women were often assigned the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs. But it was progress, and it was essential. The federal government understood that recruiting women required more than patriotic appeals. It required practical support. Daycare centers were built adjacent to factories so mothers could work without leaving their children unsupervised. Factories provided transportation, hot lunches, shopping facilities, and banking services. Some offered flexible shifts and part-time work. The effort was deliberate and sophisticated. War Production Board propaganda portrayed defense work as an extension of women's domestic duty. You were not abandoning your family. You were protecting them. You were not being unfeminine. You were being patriotic. Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover from May 29, 1943, captured the duality perfectly. His Rosie the Riveter was muscular and strong, holding a rivet gun in her lap, eating a ham sandwich with one foot resting on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. But she also wore makeup, carried a compact, and displayed her Victory Loan and Red Cross buttons like jewelry. She was both worker and woman, both warrior and citizen. The message was clear. You could do this job. You could do it well. And you could still be yourself. The less famous We Can Do It poster, created by J. Howard Miller for Westinghouse, showed a woman in work clothes with a red bandana, flexing her bicep, staring directly at the viewer with fierce determination. The poster was displayed for only 2 weeks in Westinghouse factories in February 1943. It was not widely seen during the war, but decades later, it became the iconic image of Rosie, reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to protest signs. The message endured because it was true. They could do it, and they did. The work was dangerous. Welders suffered burns from molten metal and long-term health effects from toxic fumes. Riveters developed permanent hearing loss and nerve damage from vibration. Women working in tight spaces inside aircraft fuselages sometimes became trapped and had to be cut free. Industrial accidents were common. Safety regulations existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. The pressure to produce was relentless. When the United Mine Workers struck in 1943, newspapers condemned the miners as traitors. The same public that celebrated Rosie the Riveter could be merciless toward any perceived slowdown in production. Yet most women expressed profound satisfaction with their wartime work. Interviews conducted decades later reveal a consistent theme. They felt they had contributed something meaningful. They had proven to themselves and their country that they could do a man's job and do it well. Arlene Crary of Madison, Wisconsin, worked at Boeing Building B-17. After the war, she used her earnings to build a house. Reflecting on the experience, she said it made her more open-minded, less shy, and more appreciative of teamwork. She learned to find people who would truly support her. Like many Rosies, Arlene divorced her husband after the war, using her newfound financial independence to establish a life on her own terms. Not all women wanted to continue factory work after the war ended. Many were eager to return to domestic life. But they had options now. They had skills. They had proven competence. And while massive layoffs after 1945 pushed women out of factory jobs to make room for returning veterans, the experience left a lasting impact. The generation of women who built bombers in the 1940s raised daughters who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the 1960s and 1970s. The line from Rosie the Riveter to second-wave feminism is not straight, but it is real. For African American women, the impact was even more profound. The defense industry offered wages and working conditions far superior to domestic service. It offered dignity. It offered a glimpse of what equality might look like. And while the post-war period saw many of these gains rolled back, the experience contributed to the growing consciousness that would fuel the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Discrimination had been confronted. The barriers had been breached, even temporarily. And once breached, they could never be fully restored. By 1944, American aircraft production had achieved levels that staggered comprehension. In that year alone, American factories built 96,000 military aircraft. 96,000. That was more than Japan built during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. It was more than Germany built in any single year. And it was sustainable. American production could have continued at that pace indefinitely. The consolidated B-24 Liberator became the most produced American military aircraft in history, with 18,493 built across multiple factories. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, with 12,731 produced, formed the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The North American P-51 Mustang, with 15,000 produced, gave the Allies air superiority and allowed bombers to strike deep into German territory with fighter escort. Transport aircraft like the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, with more than 10,000 built, revolutionized military logistics and enabled airborne operations from Normandy to the Rhine. From January 1, 1940 to August 14, 1945, American industry produced 300,017 military aircraft. 300,000. The number almost defies comprehension. Factories ran 24 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. At the peak in 1943, the industry employed 2.1 million workers. Those workers produced not just airframes, but 800,000 engines and 800,000 propellers. The combined weight of airframes and spare parts exceeded 2.8 billion pounds. The cost approached $45 billion, nearly 1/4 of the total American munitions budget. And this production sustained not just American forces, but Allied armies around the world. Through the Lend-Lease program, America supplied aircraft to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other nations. Soviet pilots flew American P-39 Airacobras and A-20 Bostons. British bomber crews flew American B-24s. Chinese air forces received P-40 Warhawks. The arsenal of democracy became literal. Without American production, the war would have been lost. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin acknowledged as much during the Tehran Conference in 1943, stating bluntly that without American production, the Allies could never have won. The impact extended beyond aircraft. American factories produced 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million army trucks. Shipyards launched vessels so rapidly that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that supplied Allied forces, were built at a pace of 1 per day at the height of production. In the 3 years after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Navy built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 17. By the end of the war, more than half of all industrial production in the entire world took place in the United States. American industrial output, already the world's largest in 1939, had doubled in size by 1945. It was a transformation without historical precedent. And it had been accomplished not through coercion or totalitarian control, but through the mobilization of a democratic society that chose collectively to do what was necessary. The question that haunted German military planners was simple. How? How could a nation that barely had an army in 1939 field the most powerful military force in the world by 1945? How could a country that produced fewer than 3,000 aircraft in 1939 produce 96,000 in 1944? How could factories that made refrigerators and typewriters suddenly produce tanks and bombers with efficiency that exceeded dedicated armaments manufacturers? The answer was not a single innovation, but a convergence of factors. First, America had vast, unused industrial capacity. The Depression had left factories idle and workers unemployed. When war production ramped up, there were plants ready to be repurposed and workers desperate for employment. Second, America had access to raw materials. Unlike Germany, which had to import most of its oil and many strategic metals, the United States had domestic sources of steel, copper, aluminum, and eventually synthetic rubber. Third, America had space. Factories could be built on cheap farmland without fear of bombing. Germany's industrial centers were vulnerable to Allied air raids. America's were not. But beyond these structural advantages, there was something cultural. American manufacturing had spent decades perfecting mass production techniques. Henry Ford's assembly line was not just a mechanical innovation, it was a philosophy. Break complex tasks into simple steps. Standardize components. Train workers to do one thing exceptionally well rather than many things adequately. Measure everything. Optimize continuously. These principles applied to automobiles transferred to aircraft with modifications. They transferred to tanks, to ships, to munitions. American industry did not invent mass production, but it had refined it to a degree unmatched anywhere in the world. Moreover, there was institutional flexibility. When the War Production Board compelled automobile factories to stop making cars and start making tanks, they did. When the government rationed gasoline, steel, and rubber, civilians accepted it. When women were needed in factories, they came. The social compact held. People trusted, however imperfectly, that the sacrifices were necessary and temporary. That trust enabled mobilization at a speed that centrally planned economies, for all their theoretical efficiency, could not match. Finally, there was innovation. American engineers did not simply scale up existing designs. They improved them. They developed new manufacturing techniques, new materials, and new production processes. Ford's innovations at Willow Run, the modular construction techniques used in Liberty ships, the standardization of components across multiple aircraft types, these were not minor refinements. They were transformative advances that permanently changed how large-scale manufacturing worked. The transformation was not without cost. Workers suffered injuries, hearing loss, and chemical exposure. Communities near factories experienced overcrowding, inadequate housing, and social dislocation. The federal government built entire towns, like Willow Village near Willow Run, to house defense workers, providing 30 dormitories, 6 community buildings, police and fire stations, and schools. At peak production, Willow Village housed more than 15,000 people. After the war, many of these communities became housing for returning veterans attending college on the GME bill. The social disruption was profound but manageable because it was understood to be temporary. Profiteering and corruption occurred. Unscrupulous contractors sold the government substandard steel. War housing projects produced homes with roofs that blew off in the wind and basements that flooded. Sensing political danger, Roosevelt mobilized the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, led by Senator Harry S. Truman. The committee conducted aggressive oversight, exposing waste and holding contractors accountable. Truman's work on the committee raised his national profile and contributed to his selection as vice president in 1944. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Truman became president, bringing with him an intimate understanding of industrial mobilization and government oversight. For African Americans, the war offered both opportunity and bitter disappointment. Defense industry jobs paid better than domestic service or sharecropping, but discrimination remained pervasive. Many factories refused to hire black workers until labor shortages left no alternative. Once hired, black workers were often segregated into the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs. Women of color faced double discrimination, yet even limited progress mattered. 600,000 African American women entered the defense workforce. They proved their competence. They earned better wages. They gained skills and confidence. And they returned to communities with a renewed determination to fight for the equality they had glimpsed in the factories. The experience of Japanese Americans was darker. Even as second-generation Japanese Americans volunteered for military service and served with distinction in Europe, their families were imprisoned in internment camps under the racist logic of collective suspicion. It was one of the great moral failures of the war, a reminder that even democratic mobilization can coexist with profound injustice. The irony was bitter. Japanese American soldiers fought for a country that had imprisoned their parents. Japanese American workers contributed to the war effort while their civil liberties were stripped away. The contradiction would haunt American conscience for decades. When the war ended in August 1945, the transition to peacetime production was swift and chaotic. Factories that had built bombers now had to build refrigerators again. Workers who had earned high wages in defense plants faced layoffs as military contracts were canceled. Women who had proven their competence in every aspect of industrial work were pushed out of factories to make room for returning veterans. The message was clear. Thank you for your service. Now go home. Many women did go home, eager to return to domestic life after years of grueling factory work. But many did not want to leave. They had discovered skills they did not know they possessed. They had earned wages that gave them independence. They had found purpose and community in the factories. Being pushed out was not just economically damaging. It was personally devastating. Yet there was little recourse. Veterans had priority, the economy was transitioning, and social pressure to restore pre-war gender roles was immense. Still, the experience left a legacy. Women had proven they could do the work. Employers, however reluctantly, had acknowledged that competence was not determined by gender. Daughters who watched their mothers work in factories grew up with different expectations about what women could accomplish. The line from Rosie the Riveter to the women's liberation movement of the 1960s is indirect but real. Seeds planted in wartime bore fruit in peacetime. For American industry, the post-war period brought both opportunity and challenge. The manufacturing capacity built during the war was immense. Factories that had produced bombers could produce commercial aircraft. Shipyards that built destroyers could build cargo ships. The skills, the infrastructure, and the organizational knowledge remained. America emerged from the war as the world's dominant industrial power, a position it would hold for decades. But the war also revealed the limits of industrial might. Victory required not just production, but logistics, strategy, and political will. America had built 300,000 aircraft, but aircraft alone did not win the war. They won it because they were flown by trained pilots, maintained by skilled mechanics, supported by global supply chains, and directed by strategic planning that coordinated air, land, and sea operations across multiple theaters. The lesson was sobering. Production mattered immensely, but it was not sufficient. The factories remain, though most are gone now. Willow Run closed as an automotive plant in 2010 and was largely demolished in 2014. A small section survives as the Yankee Air Museum, preserving the memory of what was accomplished there. The Douglas plant in Long Beach is gone. The Boeing facilities in Seattle have been replaced or repurposed. The physical structures have disappeared, but the legacy endures. When historians assess the outcome of World War II, they often focus on battles: Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, the turning points where armies clashed and destinies shifted. But beneath those battles was a different kind of struggle. The struggle to produce enough rifles, enough tanks, enough bombers to equip the armies that fought them. And in that struggle, America's contribution was decisive. Germany's industrial capacity, impressive though it was, could not match American output. Despite heroic efforts and ruthless efficiency, German factories produced approximately 130,000 military aircraft during the entire war. America produced more than twice that number. Japan produced even less, roughly 76,000 aircraft. The Soviet Union, with American assistance through Lend-Lease, produced substantial numbers but relied heavily on American supplies for trucks, aircraft, and raw materials. Britain, exhausted by years of war and bombing, depended on American production to sustain its forces. The phrase "the arsenal of democracy" captured a profound truth. Democratic societies, when mobilized, possessed strengths that totalitarian regimes could not match. They were flexible, adaptive, and innovative. They could mobilize civilian populations without coercion because the populations believed in the cause. They could coordinate complex industrial systems because those systems were built on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced compliance. The efficiency of democracy, so often questioned in peacetime, proved decisive in war. But there was also something distinctly American about the achievement: the willingness to attempt the impossible, the refusal to accept that what had never been done could not be done, the engineer's mentality that every problem had a solution if you worked long enough and thought hard enough. Charlie Sorensen, standing in a San Diego factory, watching workers struggle to align an engine mount with surveyor's equipment and promising a better way by morning. Henry Ford, 80 years old and stubborn as stone, insisting that mass production could be applied to anything, even aircraft, if you were willing to rethink everything. And the workers, the women who learned to rivet and weld and operate lathes, Not because they wanted to, but because their country needed them. The men too old or too essential to be drafted, working double shifts to keep production lines moving. The African Americans who endured discrimination and still showed up every day because the work mattered. The teenagers who lied about their age to get hired. The grandmothers who came out of retirement. Together, they built an air force that changed the course of human history. The silence in the phrase, built in total silence, was never about secrecy. The factories were loud. The propaganda was everywhere. Newspapers published production figures. Newsreels showed women riveting. Radio broadcasts celebrated factory openings. Everyone knew America was building planes. The Axis powers certainly knew. They could see the bombers appearing over their cities in ever-increasing numbers. They could count the fighters escorting them. They could tally the losses and realize that for every aircraft they shot down, two more took its place. The silence was something else. It was the silence of determination. The silence of engineers solving problems at 3 in the morning because the assembly line could not stop. The silence of workers too exhausted to speak, clocking out after a 12-hour shift and coming back 8 hours later to do it again. The silence of a nation that understood, without being told, that everything depended on this. That if the factories failed, the armies would fail. That if the armies failed, civilization itself might fail. There was no room for doubt, no time for debate, no patience for those who insisted it could not be done. When experts said you could not mass-produce aircraft, American industry did it anyway. When critics said women could not handle industrial work, women proved them wrong. When skeptics said a democracy could not mobilize as efficiently as a dictatorship, America mobilized faster and more completely than any nation in history. The transformation was not perfect. Mistakes were made. Lives were lost. Injustices were committed. But the fundamental achievement stands. In 5 years, America built an industrial capacity that reshaped the global balance of power. It did so without abandoning democratic institutions. It did so with the consent and participation of its citizens. And it did so at a scale that remains, even today, difficult to comprehend. Consider what 300,000 aircraft represents. If you line them up wingtip to wingtip, they would stretch nearly 15,000 miles. That is more than half the circumference of the Earth. If you stacked them, they would reach into space. If you tried to visit one aircraft per day, it would take you 821 years to see them all. These were not toys. They were complex machines, each requiring thousands of hours of skilled labor, each capable of carrying men into combat and bringing them home. And they were built by a nation that, in 1939, barely had an aircraft industry at all. Built by workers who had never seen an airplane up close, let alone built one. Built in factories that did not exist when the war began. Built with techniques that had to be invented on the fly. Built under pressure that never relented, by people who understood that failure was not an option. In the decades since, scholars have debated what made the mobilization possible. Some emphasize economics. America had the GDP, the raw materials, and the infrastructure. Others emphasize technology. American engineering and manufacturing techniques were simply superior. Still others emphasize social factors. A united population, motivated by clear threat and shared purpose, could accomplish what a divided nation could not. All of these explanations contain truth, but they miss something essential. What made American mobilization possible was belief, not naive optimism or jingoistic patriotism, though those existed, but a deeper belief that problems could be solved, that obstacles could be overcome, that if you brought together smart people, gave them resources and authority, and let them work, they would find a way. This was not universal. Plenty of Americans doubted, plenty resisted. Labor disputes erupted. Congress investigated inefficiencies. Critics attacked the War Production Board for overreach. Democracy does not eliminate disagreement, it channels it. And even in disagreement, the fundamental work continued. The factories kept running. The aircraft kept rolling off the lines. The bombers kept flying to Europe and the Pacific. There is a photograph taken at Willow Run in 1943. It shows the assembly lines stretching into the distance. B-24s in various stages of completion as far as the eye can see. In the foreground, A woman in coveralls and a bandana stands on a ladder, reaching into a wing section to install hydraulic lines. Her face is not visible. Her name is not recorded. She is anonymous. But she represents millions. That photograph captures the essence of the achievement. Not generals or politicians or industrialists, though they played their roles, but the ordinary people who did extraordinary work because their country asked them to, who learned skills they did not have, who worked hours they could barely endure, who sacrificed comfort and safety and, in some cases, health and life itself, who built, in total determination if not total silence, the instrument of Allied victory. The legacy of wartime aircraft production extends far beyond the war itself. The techniques developed at Willow Run and other plants influenced post-war manufacturing across industries. The experience of managing complex supply chains with thousands of suppliers informed the development of modern logistics. The lessons learned about quality control, standardization, and continuous improvement became foundational principles of industrial engineering. The aerospace industry that emerged after the war built directly on wartime foundations. Boeing, which produced B-17 and B-29s during the war, became the world's largest commercial aircraft manufacturer. Douglas, Lockheed, and North American Aviation all transitioned to peacetime production, building the commercial aircraft that made modern air travel possible. The engineers who designed bombers designed passenger jets. The workers who built military aircraft built civilian aircraft. The supply chains that supported war production supported commercial production. The Cold War ensured that military aircraft production never entirely ceased. The B-52 Stratofortress, first flown in 1952, was a direct descendant of wartime heavy bombers and remains in service today. Jet fighters, pioneered by Germany and refined by America in the final years of the war, became the foundation of American air superiority throughout the second half of the 20th century. The industrial capacity built to fight World War II was maintained and expanded to deter Soviet aggression. But beyond hardware, there was a cultural legacy. The generation that built the planes carried lessons into peacetime that shaped American society for decades. They had seen what collective effort could accomplish. They had seen problems that seemed impossible get solved. They had seen a nation transform itself through will and work, and they brought that mentality to post-war challenges. Building the interstate highway system, landing a man on the moon, creating the prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s. The confidence that made those achievements possible was forged in wartime factories. For women, the legacy was more complex. The immediate post-war period saw retrenchment. Women were pushed out of factories and back into domestic roles. But the memory remained, the knowledge that they had done the work, that they had been essential, that they had proven competence beyond traditional gender roles. That memory fueled the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s. The daughters of Rosie the Riveter demanded equality not as a favor, but as a right they had already earned. For African Americans, the wartime experience was a catalyst. Having proven their capabilities in factories and in segregated military units, they returned to a Jim Crow South that refused to acknowledge their contributions. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could you fight a war for democracy abroad and accept subjugation at home? The question had no good answer, and the attempt to answer it through action became the civil rights movement. The path from wartime factories to the Montgomery bus boycott to the March on Washington is not straight, but it exists. There is a tendency, in retrospect, to mythologize World War II, to see it as a simple story of good versus evil, of heroic soldiers and unified home fronts, of a nation coming together to defeat tyranny. That narrative contains truth, but it obscures complexity. America entered the war divided and emerged from it with divisions intact. Racism persisted, inequality persisted, injustice persisted. The war did not fix these problems. In some cases, it exacerbated them. Yet within that complexity, there were moments of genuine collective achievement. And aircraft production was one of them. It was not morally ambiguous. It was not tainted by the compromises and cruelties that marked other aspects of the war. It was simply a monumental task executed with extraordinary competence. 300,000 aircraft, built in 5 years, by a nation that started with almost nothing. The engineers who designed the systems were brilliant. The managers who organized production were capable. The workers who built the planes were skilled and dedicated. But brilliance and skill alone do not explain the achievement. What explains it is a willingness to attempt the impossible. To look at the goal of 125,000 aircraft per year and not laugh at its absurdity, but ask instead how it could be done. That mentality, more than any specific technique or technology, was America's decisive advantage. Not optimism, not naivete, but a kind of pragmatic determination, a refusal to be constrained by precedent, a belief that if something needed to be done, it could be done, and the only question was how. Charlie Sorensen, standing in that San Diego factory in 1941, watching workers struggle with outdated methods, did not accept the status quo. He promised a better way by morning, and he delivered. Henry Ford, told that aircraft could not be mass-produced, ignored the experts, and built the largest aircraft factory in the world. Rose Monroe, a widow with no training, learned to rivet and became good enough to train others. These were not superhuman figures. They were ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary challenges, simply did the work. The achievements of World War II aircraft production now seem almost mythical. In an age of specialization and automation, the idea of converting car factories to produce bombers in months or training millions for skilled work in weeks feels impossible. Yet from 1940 to 1945, America did exactly that. Such mobilization rested on a social compact that has since frayed: trust in government, shared purpose, and willingness to sacrifice. The industrial capacity and knowledge still exist today, but the cohesion that once united the nation is uncertain. Perhaps that makes the wartime feat even more remarkable. They succeeded without any guarantee that they could. A photograph from June 28, 1945, captures the moment's quiet power. The last B-24 Liberator stands ready at Willow Run, surrounded by weary workers, men and women, black and white, who know they have done something extraordinary that will never be repeated. The war is over, the factories will close, but the achievement endures. In 5 years, America built 300,000 aircraft, more than half the Allied total, by people who had never built planes before and never would again. It was done not in silence, but with determination, solving problems, meeting deadlines, doing the impossible until it became routine. Historians may focus on generals and battles, but the war was won in the factories, by millions who turned faith and labor into victory. That is the true meaning of building in silence, answering history's call, not with speeches, but with action. 300,000 aircraft built by a democracy of free people, proof that when united by purpose, a free society can outproduce tyranny. The factories and workers are gone, but the lesson remains. When ordinary people commit completely to a cause, the impossible becomes the next task on the line.